All right. All right. I'll get things going. Um, so there's quite a bit of things I'm going to be covering today regarding the post-COVID market review in China and Hong Kong. So this is just a brief outline of things that we'll be covering today. And without further ado, let's get into it. So here you can see a brief, well, not something we really want to remind ourselves of, but let's take a look back at the timeline of COVID situation in China first. So first case of COVID was reported in December 2019 before it spread across the nation and eventually the world in early 2020. The initial outbreak was kept largely under control through isolation and mass testing, including locking down entire cities, as you all know. International travel became almost non-existent, and life in China was punctuated by school closures, district, city, and regional lockdowns. And under these measures, the economy partly recovered until the lockdown of Shanghai from March to May in 2022, which was, well, successful in controlling the spread of the virus at the local level, but more transmissible variants led to the rapid and broad-based transmission of the virus. And for nearly 3 years, from 2020 to 2020, well, end of 22, China pretty much stuck to its zero tolerance approach to the virus, even though the policy caused unprecedented economic damage and widespread frustrations among citizens. So in 2022, growth slowed very sharply, and company profits collapsed, and youth unemployment surged to record levels. And amid the growing public unrest and financial pressure, the government abruptly changed course in December 22, pretty much effectively abandoning the zero COVID policy and reopening its border in early 2023. And between 2019 to 2023, China's economy experienced up and down when it comes to its economic performance, which is very largely shaped by the pandemic, as well as global supply chain disruptions and shifting domestic demands. The economy fluctuated throughout the pandemic years before stabilizing in 2023, as you can see in the chart. This recovery was driven by increased consumer spending, especially in services, and strong industrial production and a resilient export sector. Even so, China is growing at a much slower pace than 10 years ago. This isn't just because of COVID, but a result of the country continuing to mature and grow into the second largest economy in the world. And it is also shifting from a manufacturing economy into a consumption economy. So it wouldn't be a surprise for me if the GDP of China remains around 4 to 5% range in the future, instead of the double-digit growth in the 1990s to the early 2000s and the 8 to 10% growth in the 2010s. And so far, China's economy grew 5.3% in the first quarter of 2024, which was higher than expected, before tapering off to a 4.7% growth in the second quarter. The recovery of domestic consumption continues to lag behind production, and according to data, in March 2024, food prices declined by 2.7% compared to the previous year. And in general, consumers' purchasing behavior has shifted towards lower cost products. So in China, that's what we call consumption downgrade. Now, when it comes to consumption, China has demonstrated robust growth in both absolute and per capita terms over the past few decades. between 1996 to 2022, consumption expenditure per capita grew by 8% annually on average, but the consumption's share of the economy has continued to decline, meaning that China's households have decided to save more today rather than consuming more or upgrading their standards of living. But even so, that doesn't necessarily mean living standards aren't improving and that people aren't preferring higher quality things, but rather they are spending more wisely, and that value for money is now more important than ever. So households spent more on food and other consumer staples during the pandemic as a precautionary move to handle frequent lockdowns. The proportion spent on food rebounded to 31% in 2022 from the 28% in pre-COVID in 2019. And after China reopened in 2023, sales growth in consumer staples declined as sales of non-durable discretionary goods bounced back. And data also points to a modest recovery in consumption in 2023 and early 2024. So the most probable outcome for long-term household consumption growth is a continued slowdown over time, below the current pace of the per capita consumption growth of around 6%, and pretty much consistent with the slowdown in China's potential economic growth. But significant changes in policy or economic trajectory could also signal change in that overall trend. So during the three-year outbreak of COVID-19, inbound tourism was forced to pretty much shut down. The number of inbound tourists, that's not including domestic travels, was estimated at 20 million in 2022, only about 14% from 2019, pre-COVID. The reopening in early 2023 saw a slight recovery in inbound tourism, with 35 million international visitors entering China for both business and leisure. And in the first 7 months of this year, over 17 million tourists visited China, which was a 130% increase from the same period in 2023. And while this is still far away from the pre-COVID numbers, the $14 billion in consumer spending from the inbound tourism is a much needed boost for the domestic economy. And the surge in inbound tourism this year has been largely driven by the rollout and expansion of visa exemption policies. The first one would just be the 144-hour visa-free transit policy, which now covers 37 Chinese ports and applies to citizens from 54 countries, including the US. And this policy lets travelers with valid international travel documents and onward tickets to stay in designated areas of China for up to 6 days without a visa. And this includes Hong Kong and Macau as well. So if you have a ticket destination for Hong Kong or Macau or other places in the world, you can enter China visa-free for 6 days. And since January 2024, visa applicants are no longer required to submit proof of a round-trip air ticket, hotel reservations, itinerary, or invitation letter. So, but for invitation letter, that's doesn't apply to business visas. There's something to be aware of. And China is also making changes to make life easier for international travelers. Since first one would be, since China is very much a cashless economy right now, with digital payment pretty much the standard for everyone who's living here, it's very challenging for foreign travelers who mostly rely on cash or credit cards. Because of this, the two key players in digital payments in China, which is Alipay and WeChat Pay, WeChat, have made their apps and payment processes much more foreigner friendly by simplifying their lengthy setup processes and also starting to accept international credit cards as well. However, flights between US and China are still limited and are subjected to bilateral agreements between the two countries. And in late March, the US Department of Transportation raised the quota of weekly round trips that Chinese air carriers can fly to and from the US to 50, which was up from 35 earlier this year. And while Chinese airlines have maxed out their 50 flight quota in and out of the US every week, the three US airlines that operate services to China, which is Delta, American Airlines, and United, run just 35 flights. And so far, this has not changed. So the retail market. So during COVID, traditional retailers, their sales were hit by government restrictions and had significantly less traffic. People avoided going to crowded places, and many city governments implemented very strict controls on gatherings and parties. So following the lifting of the pandemic control measures at the end of 2022, China's consumer market has rebounded quite strongly. So in the first quarter of 2024, retail sales increased by 4.7% year on year, followed by a 3.7% increase in April and May. So this growth reflects stable consumption expansion, particularly following a surge in consumer spending during the spring festival holidays in February. And due to recovering offline consumption in the post-COVID period, most offline formats regained some sort of momentum. For example, small formats and near home stores, including groceries and convenience stores, continue to lead this growth. So at 6 and 7% growth respectively. And many large key accounts have closed down their hypermarket chains while opening new superstores or mini stores. So that leads to the number that you see here for super and mini stores growing at 4% and hypermarkets dropping by 6%. And within the hypermarkets segment, club warehouses like Costco and Sam's Club continue to experience substantial growth at 42%. Meanwhile, the growth of specialist stores is driven by a wave of opening of discount stores. For example, snack discount stores. So they sell near expiration date products at a very discounted price. So these are very popular in lower tier cities and smaller cities in China for a bit of time, but it's faded a little bit over the past several months. And even before COVID, China already has the largest e-commerce market in the world. And during the pandemic, services such as grocery delivery and online sales promotion became even more utilized. Especially, this is especially welcomed by a demographic that was previously very much largely undiscovered. So this is the elderly population, which really picked up shopping online until even up till today. And traditional retailers have also developed rapidly growing online shopping platforms, and both online sales and community group purchases increased dramatically during the COVID period. And overall, gradual shifts toward online channels continued with a slight uptick in 2023, at 4% comparing to 2% in 2022. And e-commerce platforms continue to gain share from traditional e-commerce. So we're talking about, for example, TikTok or other platforms in China that utilize a lot of influencer marketing and sales. So these platforms saw their marketing share increase quite dramatically during the COVID period and also post-COVID. For example, TikTok, their market share increased to 34%, a 12-point increase from 2022. And total e-commerce penetration increased significantly between 2019 and 2021 because of the pandemic, but it has remained stable since 2021. And food and beverage saw declines in online penetration due to the recovering food service market that was severely impacted by all the COVID restrictions. So this food service industry in China was decimated by the impact of COVID, especially for small businesses. They had to contend with the different measures that limited travel, restricted large gatherings, disrupted supply chains, and also the canceling of many major events that would have usually brought in a large share of their income. So some restaurants successfully transitioned in-store sales into online sales by providing takeout services, delivery, and whatnot. And China's restaurant as a whole reported a 22% increase in revenue through online platforms between 2021 and 2022. And despite growth, the figure was still below pre-pandemic levels. The industry showed a lot of resilience with increased consumer demand for both dining out and food delivery services, which are supported by digitalization trends and also evolving consumer preferences. And the substantial growth reflected a robust recovery for the food service sector, which had been impacted by all the COVID-related challenges in the previous years. And the industry's expansion also spurred growth in related sectors, so adding nearly $2 trillion in revenue from the agriculture and food processing industries. And the sector saw an influx of new businesses with over 4.1 million newly registered catering enterprises, the majority of which were privately owned. During COVID in 2020, the US and China signed the Phase 1 agreement, which opened up market access for 3 years of record-breaking exports to China. A lot of it were bulk commodities, but we also saw a lot of beneficial effects for products like meat products, especially for beef and poultry. And other beneficiaries include animal feed and also pet food and also alcoholic beverages. Between 2020 to 2023, China was the largest importer of agricultural products from the US in both value and volume terms. And like I mentioned, the majority were bulk commodities, but consumer products were also growing as far as the makeup of the total share. So in 2023, China was the third largest export market for consumer-oriented products from the US, importing $6.4 billion in value. And when we look at the overall export from the entire US to China, biggest takeaway is how much meat China consumes in imports. And like I said, it benefited tremendously from the phase one agreement and also from a sustained demand for meat in China since COVID. And another product that has really enjoyed growing demand in China is tree nuts, particularly pistachios and almonds, where China is currently the #1 importer in the world. And this was helped by the growing health awareness and better dietary plans people had since COVID. And also from the more frequent domestic traveling since all the COVID restrictions were relaxed, allowing people to travel back to their hometowns, to other cities and provinces for business meetings. And with that comes a lot of gift presenting. So people would buy gift boxes with tree nuts or fruits, as well as seafood, which are also seeing year-on-year growth over the past few years, along with pet food and wine. So here are a few trends, post-COVID consumer trends that we might have noticed. So the first one would be the shifting demographics. So post-COVID, the fastest growing consumer groups are the millennials, like myself, particularly those who are parents, as well as those who are over 50s, or what they call the silver-haired generation, who are either retired or already have what it takes to retire comfortably. So the millennials are tech savvy, and the older generations are also increasingly adept at using tech for researching a product and also shopping those products online. And the first group is more willing to spend on high quality products for their kids or their parents, whereas the second group is spending more for themselves, but also at times also for their grandkids. So the second trend would be health and wellness focus. Consumer health consciousness is continuing to expand. So products that are preservative free, for example, low sugar or low fat, or have fewer additives are becoming more popular, as are foods that are associated with immunity and overall wellness, reflecting a longer term trend toward healthier eating habits. Price sensitivity and brand loyalty. So consumers have become more price sensitive and are more willing to switch brands if there's a price advantage, which reflects the more cautious spending attitudes that we're seeing today. And loyalty to pre-COVID stores or brands has declined as shoppers look for more affordable and accessible alternatives. So here's a few takeaways from what we see after COVID. So the economic pressure prompts Chinese consumers to become more picky and increasingly choosing quality and functional products. So, according to research, high income consumers in China are showing an increase in spending across nearly all fast-moving consumer goods categories rather than a decrease. So, for example, 37% of individuals interviewed in this survey are willing to increase their expenditure on international spirits, while in categories such as sports drinks and fruit juice, the respective proportions were 35% and 32%. And number two, post-COVID. So U.S. suppliers doing business with Chinese buyers should ensure that they're ready to export before engaging. So since 2022, the Decree 248, which went into effect in the first day of 2022, which states that overseas exporters must register their facilities with the Chinese customs before their products can be exported. And this plays a significant role in the purchasing decisions of Chinese buyers as they seek suppliers or products that are allowed to enter the market. And inexperienced suppliers of Chinese exports remain largely disconnected from new import requirements and the current state of the market and changes since COVID. So for a market like China, potential exporters need to understand that not only the opportunities are there, but also the challenges of the market, as China has always been difficult to predict when it comes to trade policies and import requirements. So before engaging with Chinese buyers in the post-COVID era, suppliers need to not only focus on the market's absolute population, but also need to understand how its distribution network operates and how it's different from the US and how exporting to this market, it's different from exporting to other international markets as well. So that way you can avoid wasting any valuable resources and also avoiding any potential pitfalls. So after mainland China, we're going to get into a little bit about Hong Kong as well. So just a quick review of the timeline, COVID timeline for Hong Kong. So after China reported the first cases in December 2019, Hong Kong also confirmed its first case in January 2020, leading to early closures of public facilities and also mandatory quarantines for inbound travelers. And multiple infection waves led to more stricter policies. And after the third wave in July 2020, restrictions intensified, including shortened restaurant hours and also limits on gatherings. And by February 2021, Hong Kong began its mass vaccination campaign. And during the fifth wave in early 2022, the city's healthcare system was severely strained, prompting some reevaluation of its zero COVID stance. And until early 2023, Hong Kong has maintained tight border restrictions and also extended quarantines part of its approach. And these measures contributed to significant economic and social challenges. And debates over the sustainability of the approach surged. And by early 2023, Hong Kong began to ease all of its restrictions as it pivoted towards managing the virus instead of a complete lockdown. And quarantine-free travel resumed, so marking a shift towards reopening and recovery from all the prolonged isolation policies. So the economy plunged during COVID. That since rebounded fairly well at 3.2% in 2023. The consistent economic recovery was tempered somewhat by the global conditions, but maintained momentum from sustained tourism and also consumer activity in the later quarters. And it's predicted to grow between 2.5% to 3.5% in 2024. And tourism, which is one of the city's economic pillars, saw positive growth, positive return of international visitors in 2023. While most visitors did come from mainland China and also Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and Indonesia, it did host around 34 million travelers. And this figure has continued to rise in the first 5 months of 2024, growing 80% to around 18 million visitors. And so far, after the first 2 quarters of this year, that number is in line with what's forecasted. And the Hong Kong government has indicated that while the economy is expected to continue growing, there are uncertainties that could affect different sectors, such as geopolitical tensions and also changes in consumer behavior. In 2023, Hong Kong's retail industry entered a recovery period with total value of retail sales growing 16% year on year to reach 52 billion. And this was driven by the low base number in 2022 and also the reopening of travel between Hong Kong and also and mainland China, which boosted the market. However, the trend of Hong Kong residents traveling up north into southern China or overseas has impacted local retail sales. And so far this year, the local retail sales has still been slumping so far. So recovery has been slower than expected, partly due to the fact that travelers, I should say, from mainland China are not spending as much as before when they're shopping in Hong Kong, even though there is a rebound in terms of the number of travelers. Low consumer confidence on the economy is also another factor. And until then, bounce back will take time and is expected to take years for it to recover and maybe longer than expected. So Hong Kong used to have a thriving food service sector prior to COVID. And as the hotel and restaurant expansions continue, demand for high quality food and beverage by the sector is expected to remain fairly robust. Like we mentioned, Hong Kong reopened its border to the world in late 2022 and with mainland China in early 2023. And a slow return in inbound tourism positively improved the situation of the local food service sectors. And in 2022, the Hong Kong's restaurant, food and beverage purchases decreased by 4.5% compared to 2021. But in 23, the sector saw significant growth in terms of restaurant receipts. So the total value of restaurant receipts for the entire year increased by 26% comparing to the previous year in 2022. And this increase in value was accompanied by a 21% increase in the volume as well. And throughout the year, different types of restaurants experienced varying degrees of growth. So Chinese restaurants had the highest increase with a 34% increase in value. Non-Chinese restaurants increased by 23%, and fast food shops saw an increase by 18%. And bars also saw a really strong increase at 77%. So even during COVID, Hong Kong was still an important export market for the US. In 2023, US exports bounced back after 4 years of consecutive drops following the return of the economic activities in Hong Kong after the pandemic. So it still ranked as the 17th largest importer in 2023 at $1.6 billion. So different from mainland China, the vast majority of Hong Kong's food imports were consumer-oriented products. And in 2023, Hong Kong imported around $1.4 billion worth of consumer products. So some of the top exports include beef, pork, and poultry, but also tree nuts, seafood, prepared foods, fresh fruits, wine, eggs, and also processed vegetables. So most of Hong Kong's meat imports were beef with a small share of pork and poultry. Tree nuts are always popular with consumers. So demand has stayed relatively stable, as did seafood. And quite in contrary to consumers in mainland China, a lot of consumers in Hong Kong trusted and enjoyed products from the US. And that's been cultivated over the past 20, 30 years, 40 years. And products are trusted for their quality and safety, which are two factors that we're going to get into that have only grown since COVID. So post-COVID, Hong Kong has seen a notable shift when it comes to household consumption patterns. So that has been influenced by changing attitudes and also spending behaviors. So some of the key trends include value for money. So despite income levels stabilizing, many people in Hong Kong are still cautious with their spending. And a significant portion is still monitoring expenses quite closely and maintaining similar spending levels as before. And some individuals are also delaying purchases and also cutting back on more luxury items. But then even though they're budget conscious, they aren't looking for cheap products either. So their priority is to make sure that their purchases count. Increase online shopping. So consumers in Hong Kong have accelerated their use of online channels for purchases. Over 70% of people in Hong Kong have increased their use of e-commerce for grocery shopping. And more than 80% said they're likely to continue using online channels to buy groceries in the future. And consumers in Hong Kong like to use a combination of offline and online channels throughout the buying process. So from initial research to the final purchase. And finally, not only are consumers more conscious about their well-being and are seeking innovative products that offer sustainable production, nutritional value, and convenience at a reasonable cost, but they are increasingly interested in learning about the backgrounds of their food and also the production of it. So a few key takeaways. So compared to mainland China, yes, Hong Kong is a smaller market. It is challenging for most importers to meet the MOQ of a full container. And also because of the limited living space, consumers in Hong Kong have a preference for a smaller packaging size. And this remains true after COVID. And as the awareness of organic, healthy, sustainable, socially responsible, etc., grows, more and more customers in Hong Kong are starting to care about the storytelling part in a product or a brand. And yes, Hong Kong is it's a completely different market from mainland China with an independent and transparent operation system and also an easier trade environment. So it is more simple for exporters to export products to Hong Kong rather than to China. So, for example, Hong Kong currently does not have complicated laws regarding the import of organic food products. So, going back to mainland China, if organic products must be certified by the Chinese authorities in order for you to have an organic label displayed on the shelves, and that costs quite a lot of money and time. But the Hong Kong market does not have that issue, and it recognizes the USDA organic label. So that is a convenience for a lot of producers or exporters of organic products. Yeah, so that's my presentation for today. Hopefully you guys are able to get some useful information out of it, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you, Ian. If anyone has any questions, I encourage you to please take this time to ask them. You can either, excuse me, you can either take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask, or if you would rather write it in the chat, feel free. But these last few minutes are dedicated to these questions, so if you have any, please. But in the meantime, I'll just take up some more space. I am going to follow up with a recording of this meeting, as well as the slides that Ian was sharing. Oh, sweet. Someone has a question. Stuart, please take yourself off mute and feel free.
What resources can we get to help with that registration process? Getting products registered. We actually have some demand currently.
So there's a lot of information currently available on the USDA GAIN reports. So we can share that link with you guys, so you can actually have all of the process on record, so you can actually take your time to go through it. It's a relatively complicated process. It's not easy, and we'll be dedicating a webinar for that process in about I think 2 to 3 weeks, if I remember correctly, on the 29th.
Do you find it better to have like an in-country partner to help you with that process, and how reliable, or I mean, do you have companies that are kind of vetted? I hate to engage with somebody you don't really know who they are, and are they reliable and trustworthy? They just
Right.
going to take your money and drag you through a process that doesn't really take you anywhere.
Right. So in short, I'm not gonna dive into this too deeply, but the registration process is divided into two parts. So if you're a producer or exporter of, let's say, meat or seafood or dairy, your local, let's say, FDA or the USDA office is going to be responsible for registering it for you. But if you're an exporter or a producer of, let's say wine or snacks or tree nuts, that's a
Juice
self-registration. Okay, so that's a
like botanical
self-registration.
juice powders. Yeah.
All right. So I think that goes into the second category, definitely. So it will be a self-registration process. There's a dedicated website that allows you to plug in all your information for the registration process. So yeah, I believe we can definitely share some information from the USDA reports after this webinar.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, if you want to like send that link or something to me, Ian, I can put it in the follow-up email that I will probably send tomorrow. And there are some questions in the chat. If you're ready, I can just read them to you.
Sure.
The first one is from James. They say, are there examples of the online retailers available and how that transaction would work? This is intended for HKG, but would also, or Hong Kong, but would also be interested in China.
Online retailers in Hong Kong. Yeah, sure. So the biggest one currently right now is called HKTV Mall, which is a bit like, it operates a bit like Amazon, I would say. So you have different vendors all under the umbrella of one banner. So that's the biggest e-commerce platform in Hong Kong right now. And then you have other smaller retailers that have opened up their online portal, I would say. So they have their online shops. So there's quite a few. For example, Z Store, it's one of them. And then it's the funny thing is the Hong Kong e-commerce environment is a little bit different from the one in mainland China. So in mainland China, you have several, maybe 3 to 4 major platforms. So for example, Tmall, JD, PDD, and I forgot the other one. But in Hong Kong, you have different smaller platforms that were operated by either the importer or a retailer. So 2 different environments.
Okay. The next question is from Nicole. Does WeChat Pay work like Zelle?
I have very limited
I've
experience with
never heard of
Zelle.
Zelle.
But
Yeah.
I do have it, but it's a little different. I guess it's how should I differentiate the two? So WeChat Pay is more like Apple Pay, I would say. So you can go to any store, buy your groceries. You have a QR code at the register, and you scan that QR code. You just pay whatever you're owed. I don't know if that's similar to how Zelle works, but
Yeah, I'm not sure either. The next question is, how are proposed tariffs on EU ag products changing importer behavior?
tariffs on EU products. I think this is relatively new. So no, I haven't seen any particular changes as far as behavior from importers. So I would say their focus remains on several key factors. So A, price. B, the availability of a product. So if you can supply consistently of the same amount, volume, or quality of that product, that's a major factor as well. So if you say tariffs on the EU products, then if that increases pricing of it, then yes, I would think it would change how importers decide where they're going to purchase products from.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Spuds and Friends, I see your question that's a little bit broad. We can maybe speak outside of this meeting to get a little bit more detail of what you're looking for. But if anyone has any more specific questions for Ian or the Chinese market or anything like that, feel free. We have a few minutes. If not, we can let you go early. But yeah, so I'll follow up tomorrow with the PDF of Ian's slides, the recording of the presentation, also the link to the gains or what you were speaking about earlier. Yeah, I'll have that link in there too. And then also, like he said before, we have webinars coming up with Ian as well. The China Decree 248. That is happening the 29th of this month. So I'll also have links to those upcoming webinars as well, so you can sign up. But other than that, all I'm seeing in the chat is great presentation and some thank yous.